Trump on June the 8th praised Mexico for a huge deal on immigration. And he says, and this is New York Post, June the 8th, Mexico agrees to keep Central American migrants seeking asylum in the U.S. on the Mexican side of the border until their cases are decided. Tell me how this will affect your job or how we're going to implement this new immigration policy.
The program that you are discussing, Congressman, is a program that we have been working with the government of Mexico on certain individuals.
Before June the 8th?
Yes, sir.
How long have you, so was it a big deal on June the 8th, or was it a deal that had already been on the works?
The government of Mexico has agreed to expand that operation. We had been doing it with California.
How are they expanding it?
Accepting more individuals back to wait for their hearings.
So how many were they accepting, and how much are they expanding?
There wasn't a set number per se, but we had started it in California and in the El Paso.
If you don't, and I'm not trying to be argumentative with you, I'd love to talk to you about this offline.
Certainly.
But I'm trying to figure out, as this program expands in this humanitarian crisis in terms of these refugees being now housed, if I should say, on the Mexican side, how is that going to address our resource allocation north and maybe in the southern border to make sure we do the right thing when it comes to a humanitarian crisis?
Well, we work very closely with the government of Mexico when it comes to...
Do you have any specifics on that, though?
Are you asking for numbers, or are you asking
Specific, yeah. Do we have any thoughts of how we're going to implement this expanded plan?
Yes, we have coordinated with the government of Mexico. It's dependent upon them having the ability to take a certain number each day. We have already expanded that number. It does vary from day to day because it is dependent on...
Let me shift you real quick. I've got 2 minutes, unfortunately. Secretary Kelly, when he was head of Homeland Security, he was in this committee, and I asked him a question. In my words, his answer, we talked about border security. He said, it's not about border security. It's about regional security and coordinating with our allies around the world. And he considered Mexico as one of our allies. And you mentioned your issue is you don't know, you're concerned about the things you don't know. So my question to you would be, are you coordinating with the Mexican authorities to identify, are you in coordination from Mexico and maybe Colombia on the issues of immigration and possible drugs?
So we have coordinated with Mexico for years, and we work very closely with our partners in Mexico. We also have individuals stationed...
So we're not going at this alone. We're not going at this alone.
And we have individuals stationed worldwide in various countries specific to immigration issues, drug trafficking, and the such, working closely with various governments.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because when I was in San Ysidro about 6 months ago, I went in and I looked at your station there, and I looked at their board. They have a blackboard or whiteboard with the names of the individuals they had actually apprehended that evening or the evening before. Half the names were Hispanic. The other half were actually Indian surnames. And I say this to you because you're right when you talk about this refugee crisis is not just regional. I think it's worldwide. Finally, in the 20 seconds that I have, another article in Wall Street Journal 2 days ago, U.S. seizes massive haul of cocaine aboard a ship in Philadelphia. This is the latest in a series of large cocaine busts along the East Coast. You mentioned some numbers on drug seizures. How would you compare the drug seizures along the border inland versus those at sea?
Well, it would be difficult. I don't want to speak for my partners at the port.
Because I've talked to the Coast Guard, my subcommittee addresses, and they told me the seizures off their coasts are record-breaking as well.
I would say that we are having a lot of seizures everywhere, sir.
Thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you offline a little bit more. I yield.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. To all of our witnesses, first I want to thank you for your service to our country. I want to thank you for what you're doing as you are attempting to manage what is a very difficult situation along our southwest border. I want to speak a little bit on drugs, kind of follow up on the question that you were just asked. Do we continue to have a drug crisis along our southwest border? And that would be to each witness. Would you agree? Would each witness agree that we currently have a drug crisis along our southwest border?
Yes, I would agree.
And General, I think you addressed that in your report that, or your written testimony that you gave. You state that through FY 2019, with the National Guard support, CBP has over 26,500 apprehensions, 18,000 pounds of marijuana, methamphetamines, and fentanyl have been seized. Could you expand on that just a little bit, please, sir?
Those are the numbers that we have through the Counter-Drug Task Force and working with a multitude of law enforcement, both federal, state, and local entities. The flow of illicit narcotics continues on the southwest border, and unfortunately, the Arizona corridor is a heavily trafficked corridor. There's been quite a bit of violent activity in that area over the last 6 years. Most recently, with the opioid crisis, the huge increase in Mexican black tar heroin has been the one thing that we've seen as a big uptick over the last 2 years.
And Chief, maybe you can speak on this. How does the current immigration crisis that we're seeing along our southwest border, how does that affect your operations as you attempt to stop the flow of illegal drugs into our country?
It's pulling my manpower away from the ability to deal with the border security mission, and I can tell you that the smugglers are certainly taking advantage of that. While my men and women are dealing with a humanitarian crisis, we have had examples where they have run large groups. We have apprehended over 193 groups of 100 people or more at a time already this year, fiscal year to date. They'll run a large group of people, and then while my agents are distracted dealing with that, they're running narcotics in other areas, and this is a tactic that they use.
And so because of lack of manpower to basically perform both missions simultaneously, the drug cartels are using the human trafficking and the immigration as a way to distract, to tie up your manpower, your resources, and then at the same time, they are using that as an attempt or an ability to smuggle illegal drugs in our country. Would that be correct?
That is correct.
And you're saying that the drug cartels and drug organizations in Central and South America are aware of this problem, and they are using this problem as a way to continue to get illegal drugs into our country?
Yes, they are.
And how have you seen this recent crisis that we are experiencing today? How does it differ from past immigration crises that we've seen along our border?
The key is the demographic shift. When we've had numbers of, and it was mentioned earlier, of 1 million apprehensions previously, that demographic has been generally single adult Mexican nationals who could be voluntarily returned, and many of them were. It also was a difference of the numbers I call them apples and oranges. You're comparing apples and oranges. I personally would catch the same group in Douglas, Arizona back in the 1990s 3 times. So that was counted as 3 apprehensions. The numbers that we are catching now we do not have a high reapprehension rate because most of them are being brought into the country. So the demographic has changed. It takes a lot more for my manpower to process these individuals. And then there's the humanitarian care issues that we are dealing with, too, and the time that it takes to deal with that. 76 trips to the hospital a day with individuals that we are apprehending.
And Chief, just very quickly before my time is up, if additional funding was appropriated by Congress, could you use additional manpower along our southwest border to prevent illegal drugs from flowing into our country?
Most definitely.
And if Congress were to change our current immigration laws or asylum laws so that we did not have the flood of individuals coming into our country seeking asylum, would those changes, in your opinion, would it also help you and your agency better be able to keep out illegal drugs from coming into America?
Yes, it would.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Higgins for allowing me to join the subcommittee today. The San Diego sector has seen tens of thousands of migrants, including unaccompanied children, family units, and single adults arrive at our border since October. The city, the county of San Diego, the state of California, and many local organizations and volunteers have stepped in to take care of the migrants entering the community. I'm certainly grateful for their dedication and hard work. And the relationship between this CBP and the armed services is not new in San Diego, as you well know. Particularly, I visited with Border Patrol officers most recently in March and saw how the Coast Guard supports border security operations in a pretty seamless way. The Coast Guard Medical Corps has been asked to assess CBP's medical programs, which is critical to make sure that the migrants are being taken care of, especially after these treacherous journeys. I think the concern we have is that the federal government has relied on its military forces to enhance enforcement outside of the normal relationship, and that maybe we're deploying the military in places where that's really not the appropriate personnel. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. Mr. Celestes, the DOD is currently reviewing, I understand, the request to house an additional 1,400 unaccompanied children. Is that correct?
Sir, that's actually been approved. Okay. We're going to house those children at Fort Sill.
Great.
And they should start being housed there sometime mid-July, sir.
So tell me how you assign the duties. How does the department work with CBP or HHS to set up and maintain the facilities, and who staffs them and who oversees it?
So, sir, HHS is responsible for the children, as you point out, and we work very closely with them. They come to us and ask that we identify facilities and potentially land to house the children. They would establish soft-sided facilities if they were going to use the land. What we've done is that they go out and they do a site assessment at a military facility like they did at Fort Sill. They look at the facilities that are available to them to house the children. They make an assessment based on the location and their ability to provide the services that are needed. DOD does not provide any services. We just provide the facility. They provide the care to the children, and that's the way that it unfolds.
I wanted to say that when I visited the border in March, it was made very clear to us that the DOD understands its role. They were providing logistic support and reconnaissance, and I guess that's within their scope of their expertise. But the other thing we heard, Chief Provost, was that there were authorized positions in CBP that you couldn't fill. So I understand that there must be some obstacles to getting people hired. Can you tell me what those are?
Well, certainly there's a lot of competition in the law enforcement world in general right now when it comes to hiring. That being said, last year was the first year we made progress. We hired more people than we lost, and we are on track to do that again this year. But I certainly need many, many more resources. We have expanded our recruitment program. We are seeing more individuals come into the pipeline, as we would call it. My academy is currently full, which is a good sign. First time it's been in a few years. All of the classes are full through the fiscal year. So I am happy to see those kinds of numbers coming in. But it does take time to hire for federal law enforcement, and particularly into CBP through the process. We have expedited the process, the hiring process, and taken several steps in that area as well.
It'd be my preference. I suspect that most of my colleagues would like to see CBP doing the CBP jobs and for you to hire up so that the military could go back to more characteristically military functions rather than border staffing. But the other side of that is this processing coordinator, which is a new role, too, for CBP. You may have touched on this with Ms. Torres-Small, but are the qualifications going to be different from typical agents for that kind of position?
It is a lesser qualification, and Ms. Torres-Small did ask about it. We are in the process of finalizing exactly what that position will be like, the training that is involved, but the duties will be to be able, the position is there so that I can put my Border Patrol agents back doing their main job.
And what would be the expectation about the processing coordinator developing relationships with local organizations that are providing these kinds of humanitarian services?
I cannot say at this time in relation to working with them. I know, we work very closely with several non-governmental organizations across the southwest border.
And I've run out of time, but I just ask you to look at that because a lot of people are on the ground responding to the Trump administration's change of policy back in October. I think we can learn a lot from each other, and I look forward to that. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I'd like to thank the chairwoman for her courtesies extended, and I want to thank the ranking member for his. And also let me thank all of the witnesses that are here today for their service to the nation. This is a committee that I've served on before in the midst of, however, the heinous and terrorist act of 9/11 as this whole department was being created. So there's a long standing relationship with both the Homeland Security Department, its creation, the broadness of its jurisdiction, and then, of course, the committee that has oversight. And I would say that though we have certainly had common interests with the Department of Defense, this is an issue of the utilization of the Defense Department has always been of concern. So let me first of all ask to General McGuire, how many troops are there on the border now?
We currently have 564 Arizona soldiers and airmen deployed, and our 546. We have a resource allocation and could be up to 764 in Arizona. The total number between Arizona and Texas operating under gubernatorial authority, I think, is just over 2,000.
So these are National Guard?
All of the forces that are subordinate to Governor Ducey and myself are National Guardsmen. There are additional Title X active component. Mr. Sales has mentioned primarily Marine Corps and Army folks. Don't have those specific numbers.
Are they in the hundreds? You're saying there's over 2,000 military personnel?
If it's helpful, I can answer those questions.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. So there's 2,700 active duty military members deployed in support of CBP. They're deployed in all 9 sectors in all 4 border states. And as General McGuire pointed out, there's roughly 2,000 National Guard personnel deployed. The predominance of the National Guard folks are deployed, military members are deployed in Texas and Arizona. There are a small number in California and New Mexico.
All right, so the larger numbers are in Arizona and Texas. Who is defining on a day-to-day basis the role that the military plays? So first, there's a leadership directive from Washington, I assume. Who's doing that, but who's giving them assignments day to day?
The assignments that are happening day to day are done at the operational level. We receive requests, the Department of Defense receives requests from the Department of Homeland Security for the specific requirements that they would like us to assist with, whether that's helicopters or mobile surveillance camera operators, the type of military support that we're providing right now. That's approved by the Defense Department, by the Secretary of Defense, and then the operational commanders below that, in this case, Northern Command for the active component, and the individual tags like General McGuire, who's managing the National Guard for Arizona, and the tag from Texas who's managing.
Thank you. My time is short, so let me, I appreciate it. Chief, let me ask you questions very quickly. People are appalled, and we will be providing as much money. I want to put on the record, it shouldn't be a Republican or Democratic matter, but the conditions of the border are compounded by the administration's rules and policies and precipitous announcements. Tell me, have you gotten a more credible health structure? When I was there, Coast Guard were working off of a table with some chairs as it relates to health care. And then have you improved the conditions that women and children are living in, particularly those who manage to get across the border? I know there are conditions on the other side of the border with Mexico, but the conditions and the visuals are dastardly, and children shouldn't be treated that way. So if you can answer that, and then the second component is, what participation will you have if the president goes ahead with, again, a thoughtless proposal of deporting 1 million people next week. What role will you have, Chief?
If I may address that first and foremost, the role of Interior Enforcement is Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
I know it is, but they have to cross the border. So you all are at the border. So if they're not flying, they're crossing the border. I understand that.
I do not have a role in relation to.
So you have not heard from them on the policy as to what you all will be doing.
That is not something that within CBP
that you have heard that you would be participating in. You have not heard.
I have not heard that.
All right, then could you go on
to address the issues and you point out very relevant concerns that we all have. My facilities were never built to house this demographic. They were built in the 80s and 90s, mainly focused on housing single adults. And once again, CBP does not do detention. It's my goal to get everybody out of my custody and care as quickly as possible. This is why Health and Human Services, when it comes to unaccompanied children, needs the beds to be able to take them into their care. And when it comes to single adults, I need ICE to have funding. The family units, we are processing and removing and releasing as quickly as we possibly can. That being said, we have added some soft-sided structures to expand. We have added shower trailers, things like that, all of the consumables for humanitarian care. This is part of the reason that I need funding to help deal with this humanitarian crisis. So and on the medical, we have expanded the contract. We have a medical contract. We have expanded that. We are continuing to try to expand that further. My facilities are restricted somewhat in relation to what I have available for them to work in, but we are trying to do the best that we can with what we have.
Well, the disaster supplemental is being worked on. You're absolutely not right. We should, in a bipartisan manner, nonpartisan manner, get you the dollars that you need to deal with the population that you have. You're not establishing the policy. So I hope that we can work together to get that done. Thank you, Madam Chair, very much.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the witnesses for appearing as well. I, too, would like to echo the premise that this is not about conservatives or liberals, Democrats or Republicans. It's really about people and about our border. And I believe that we have a responsibility to secure our border. And I believe we also have a responsibility to deal with refugees, persons who are fleeing harm's way. And my suspicion is that each of you would concur with the necessity to secure the border as well as follow the law and deal with persons who are fleeing harm's way. Now, if someone differs with me on what I've said, I would kindly ask you to respond. Thank you. I take it you agree with me. And a lot of what we're doing in responding is based upon perceived facts. Perceived facts. You're all honorable people and you deal with facts. We do have some porous borders south of Mexico. Is it fair to say that El Salvador has a porous border? I was there just recently. Chief, would you kindly respond?
Yes, I would say so.
Is it fair to say that they don't have the level of border security that we have?
I'm not an expert on their security, but I would say that is correct.
Same thing would probably apply to Honduras and Guatemala. That would be my speculation. Like you, I'm not an expert, but I've been reading about these things, and it seems like they have some porous borders, and that contributes to some extent to what's happening at our border. Fair statement?
Yes, I would certainly say, well, as I stated in my opening statement, there are many individuals, not just the Northern Triangle folks, that are traversing through those countries to come up to our border.
And Major, would you concur that we have these problems with these countries and their borders?
Congressman, I have only visited Guatemala. Can't discuss at all El Salvador and Honduras. But yes, I've been briefed that they have similar problems with inability to secure cross-border transnational activity.
It seems to me that our military was deployed based upon facts that were submitted. Is that a fair statement in terms of the deployment of the military conditions at our border? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, Congressman, it is.
One of the facts that seem to be in dispute is the fact that our border is the weakest in the world. Our border is not weaker than Honduras or El Salvador, Guatemala. We have a border that we want to secure, but I think we should acknowledge that it's not the weakest in the world. If you think our border is the weakest in the world, please speak up. I take it you agree that it's not the weakest in the world. I mention this not because of your honor and your integrity, but the Chief Executive Officer of the United States of America, known to all of us as the President. That's his statement. He made some of his decisions based upon his belief that our border is the weakest in the world. We ought not deploy our assets based upon fallacious information. Assets should be deployed based upon certainty and facts. I lived around military people for a good deal of my life, all honorable people. This was not a fair statement to be utilized to deploy our assets, the weakest in the world. We don't have the weakest border in the world. I do believe that there are some things we can do, but we ought not fabricate stories to deploy assets. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. We're going to go into a second round of questioning. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Celestis, on May 8th of 2019, Acting Secretary Shanahan issued a memo conveying a new policy for sharing information with Congress and the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. This policy states that access to plans, operational orders, and executive orders will be limited based on a number of factors and could be used to limit access to important information needed to support congressional oversight. Can you tell me what those limitations are?
Congressman, I don't know what those limitations are. I do know that we're working very closely with the GAO right now to share information on what the Defense Department is doing. I know there's a GAO audit underway. I've met with GAO personally. We do have a process in place to share a lot of information that has been published by the Defense Department, and we're continuing to do that. I don't know the specifics of the memo in regards to what will be shared and not shared.
Were you part of putting that together? Were you consulted at all?
The memo, no memo wasn't.
So you can't tell us right now what the limitations were that then Acting Secretary Shanahan was talking about?
No, but I'm sure I can find out and
well, if you could please let the committee know.
Absolutely, ma'am.
Because it seems to me that there are far-reaching implications if there are going to be limitations put on information sharing for this committee to do our appropriate oversight. So I would appreciate you sharing with us those limitations. In response to DHS's April 2019 request for assistance, Acting Secretary Shanahan announced that DoD would make an exception to its practice of prohibiting DoD personnel from serving in roles that requires interaction with migrants in their daily activities. What limitations or restrictions remain in place for DoD personnel who are deployed to the U.S. Mexico border, and what are the DoD's red lines for what active duty personnel cannot do in terms of border operations?
Specifically, as it relates to that request, that was the request for the drivers. We're going to provide 160 drivers. We're also providing 100 military personnel to assist with handing out meals. We've worked very closely with DHS and CBP in the conduct of our military personnel that will be in and around migrants, specifically on buses. The Border Patrol will have a Border Patrol agent. There will be no custodial requirements for any DOD personnel in that process of either handing out the meals of those or driving the buses, and that's what that's focused on.
Ms. Provost, do you have any, or Chief Provost, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say that is correct. There are certain duties that, of course, are inherently law enforcement related, and we retain those duties. Mr. Salas was exactly correct on how that is being carried out when it comes to transport and the meal prep and assistance.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Salas, if you could follow up and provide the committee with those limitations that we spoke of before, I would appreciate that.
Yes.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On April the 4th, 2018, President Trump launched Operation Guardian Support, which directed the Secretary of Defense to deploy National Guard personnel under Title 32 authority to support Customs and Border Protection in securing the southwest border. Operation Guardian Support relieves Border Patrol agents from non-law enforcement duties, allowing them to focus on border security. Chief Provost, would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
Does that clarify what we're talking about today
Certainly.
regarding DOD support? My
Certainly,
colleague
as well as other
mentioned,
support.
My colleague mentioned the need to return to, I believe the quote was military role rather than border staffing. Let us clarify for the American people watching, please. Mr. Celestis, you are the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense Integration and Defense Support of Civil Authorities for DOD. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And the DOD forces that are deployed to assist in Operation Guardian Support, are they not serving in MOS-specific military operational specialty-specific roles?
They are providing support to DHS
According to their MOS.
in the vast majority of them, yes.
In other words, you have pilots and air crews flying planes. You don't have them doing vehicle maintenance, do you?
There are individuals doing vehicle maintenance.
You have vehicle maintenance MOS guys doing
do,
vehicle
yes, sir.
maintenance, right?
Correct, sir.
You have truck driver MOS driving trucks. You don't have them monitoring cameras. So just to clarify for America, the DOD personnel deployed in Operation Guardian Support are performing their military role according to their training. They're not just randomly performing border staffing. Is that correct? General, please answer.
Yeah, to the max extent possible, we align them with their MOS. So an 88 mic truck driver will be driving heavy trucks. An engineering soldier will be operating heavy equipment to support movement of our formations. Our aviation maintenance guys will be repairing the helicopters that we sustain. The pilots are flying.
Thank you, General, for clarifying that. I'd like to also clarify my colleague, whom I greatly admire, Mr. Greener. She was here. He quoted the president as saying that we have the weakest border in the world. I'd just like to clarify that the quote was actually that we have the weakest immigration laws anywhere in the world, and that Congress must change our weak immigration laws. I don't believe that the president has stated we have the weakest border or border security forces in the world, and I'd just like to clarify that. Chief, again, please share with us your thoughts on what would happen within your forces should Congress act and approve the supplemental funding and provide the resources that you've asked for. What would happen with your staffing, your morale? What would be the response within your ranks, ma'am?
Well, certainly part of what we have been asking for is more manpower, as well as retention incentives to support the amazing work that my men and women are doing. But on top of that, all of the support that is needed. Currently, I'm using operational funds to deal with the humanitarian crisis, and that is taking away from equipment and resources that my men and women need to do their jobs. As well as I stated before, the funding that is needed for ICE. I need Immigration and Customs Enforcement to have beds to take these single adults out of my care and custody. I have approximately 8,000 in custody right now that I cannot release single adults. If I release single adults, we will lose the border. I have said that before. If we do not have some kind of consequence for violating the law and illegally crossing our borders, then I don't know what I'm here for, in all honesty, or my men and women. And
so
our board. Go ahead.
Would you concur, Chief, that the sovereignty of our nation is at stake here?
It is, and I will tell you that the borders that I am concerned with and the ones that I am responsible for are our borders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the second round of questioning. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chief, just want to follow up a little bit on what Ranking Member Higgins was just talking about. In your written testimony on page 4, the conclusion, you state border security is national security. There is no difference, and the crisis on our southwest border puts our national security at risk. I have repeatedly asked Congress to act to address the outdated legal framework and broken immigration system that has caused dangerous mass migration with no end in sight. Without legislative solutions, CBP expects the need for continued DoD support to help address the diversion of resources away from the border mission to the current humanitarian crisis. And just giving you a platform, Chief, what do you believe that we can do as Congress to help stem the crisis that we're seeing along our border?
Well, first and foremost, we need to address the legal framework issues, as I stated. Specifically, we have to have the ability to hold families together in an appropriate setting throughout an expedited immigration process. We have to do that. That's why families are flooding into this country, because the word has gotten out. Smugglers say, tell them, bring a child, you will be released into the country. We have to have that ability. We need to eliminate the double standard for non-contiguous unaccompanied children, and that is where we have no ability to return children to their homeland if they are not Mexico or Canada. We also need to tighten up the asylum process to address the low bar for credible fear, as many of those who meet the bar for credible fear do not meet the bar for asylum, as well as the supplemental funding that we so desperately need.
And let me talk about that, Chief. Because Congress has failed to bring to a floor a bill that would provide the supplemental funding to deal with the ongoing humanitarian crisis, has that made the situation along our southwest border better or worse?
It has definitely made it worse.
And has our lack of ability to, again, pass a supplemental funding request, has that affected the morale of the men and women who serve in your agency?
Yes, I would most certainly say so. As I stated before, that supplemental is more than just the funding that I need, because my partners don't have the funding they need. That has a negative impact on my workforce. We have to maintain custody, for instance, longer of single adults, and that is not the responsibility of my men and women. They should be out securing the border.
And I want to talk a little bit about the detention centers there along the southwest border. Are you familiar with those detention centers, Chief?
Yes, sir.
All right. Recently, a member of Congress has referred to those detention centers as concentration camps, remarks which myself and other members of Congress find highly offensive. Would you care to comment on that matter, particularly in light of the fact that you and the administration has repeatedly requested supplemental funding so that we can better, in a more humanitarian fashion, house individuals? Congress refuses to act upon that, and yet we continue, as certain members of Congress continue to criticize what you are doing with the limited resources that you have. So in the last minute or so of my time, would you care to comment on those remarks?
I personally find them offensive. My men and women, as well as the men and women in ICE, are doing the best that they can with the limited resources that they have. I'm calling agents who are bringing toys in for children and buying them with their personal money. Agents are bringing in clothes. They're feeding babies. They are going above and beyond day in and day out to try to care for these individuals to the best of their ability. And this is not what they were trained or what they signed up for to do. So I am extremely offended by those comments.
Well, Chief, again, I want to personally thank you and the men and women that serve under your leadership for the way that y'all are handling this very difficult crisis. And I want you to know that there are members of Congress who will work to try to see that you have the resources